such a thing as one mind, but we consider it useful fiction, and therefore we say, yeah, we'll model it with one mind, and then do the modifications relative to that universal mind, which is what I had a diagram, but I didn't really get into it. The funny little bump mushroom sort of looking sort of apple thing.
Oh, with the
I can
twisty
share it
tube in
again.
the middle. Okay, yeah, I gotcha. So you're going with a single mind, universal mind, something along those lines, and then every mind is like a fragment of that kind of thing.
Matter is a fork of, it's like a tuning fork that becomes attracted to the order of the mind. So it's, you think of a simplistic metaphor as when you have those tiny little filings and they're put in a proximity of a magnet and they take on a structure.
Okay,
You know what I
I
mean?
think I've
How
got the
there's like
shape of
the
it.
little,
How?
there's just the filings and then the magnet comes and then they come up. It's kind of like that. The matter is being polarized or ordered by the mind.
Alrighty. How how does one verify a model like that? Like, how do you know that?
Well, that kind of comes down to opening the door about a conversation about what is most important in science, because we haven't really had that conversation yet. Like we're sort of saying science has to be everything. You know, we got this crazy T-Jump intro video. It's like it's like maybe trying to be all things to all people or something. But we would have to have a conversation and say, you know what, the most important thing about science, let's just say, is the ability to make predictions.
Sure, and can this universal mind model make predictions that we can test?
Yeah, but then it's a description. And so there's a question about differentiating a description from a prediction. And so the predictions would be things like aggregate. On the aggregate scale, the thermodynamic efficiency will always increase.
Okay, well, I'm gonna stew on that for a minute. T-Rock, I want to bring you in here. Um, I understand you are not a fan of deep time, which is why I tailored my presentation specifically to deal with stuff we can observe in the present. But
Hi, and welcome back to my show, Philosophy of AI at Church of Edgerby. Can't wait to discuss all the fun stuff I've been doing with this technology because, oh my God, I've been like, well, I've been talking about this to a lot of people for a while. I haven't streamed about it per se. But it's been like, I don't want to say it's the only thing I've been thinking about, but I don't know how long ago approximately when kind of the pre Dolly stuff came out. Um I was just like trying to sort of push the boundaries of what I could do on the I guess the free ones that were not really anywhere close to as good as that, which seems to have gotten slightly better, but I was still having fun with it because I kind of like the not intentionally crappy stuff, but like if it's too perfect, you basically can't do much with it because it's like, what's the saying? You know, you can't improve on perfection, but then when there's fuzzy parts, you can like layer them together. And I think that's where this stuff is the most fun is the layering of various Dolly or Midjourney images to create these various effects, which I've got displayed. And I don't know how good. I know people are always complaining about the quality of the images on this thing, but hopefully it's not terrible. Hopefully it's not terrible. So thanks to everyone for who's here now, who's watching. I really appreciate it. And I hope you enjoy what I've got ready for you today, which I'm kind of like slightly baiting and switching because it's not going to be as exciting as these pretty pictures, which are super, I mean, at least to me, they are super exciting, but we'll see. we'll see how it all plays out. So what I've been doing is just it's like it seems I can't really imagine what it must seem like to someone who's never tried this stuff. Like my guess is that it would be hard to think. So that would be your basic like um what do you want to call it? A bottleneck. So you would have probably some success getting good images, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to keep going making the images because kind of burned yourself out on that one prompt. So hi, Bob Elvis and Purple Hickman for commenting in my pretty much empty chat, but hopefully will become more full once I start discussing some super exciting concepts that I've got ready for today, as well as my last debate, which I had a lot of fun, but like it's not super much my favorite topic. It's pretty contentious. I just realized that it said Evo skeptics right under me, like probably the entire debate, the entire debate. So yeah, mm, I was uh I was extremely overjoyed though to be able to do that debate with T Jump because I feel like it's a good vibe and it was better than our first one. Although the topic for our first one was I thought a lot better. It was, I think, pantheism. I won't go into all that, but it's kind of funny because we both profess to be, well, at the time, we're both professing to be pantheists. I mean, that was kind of why I debate him. So it's like, you want to say you're a pantheist, I'm just like, maybe give people another alternative that isn't quite so um, unfulfilling. And unfortunately, at the time, I didn't really have the words to express it because I was more going in the whole taking things literally with scientism of like, well, if you can scientifically prove metaphysics, like honestly, I think I actually believe this at some point and to some weird extent still do. Uh, yeah. Hi, Stephanie, who said that they like me from a flat earth thing on MDD. I was nice and cordial. Oh yeah, I love those debates because it's just so easy to open the door to talk about like the interesting parts about epistemology. Cause I mean, it gets a little weird because like, I guess with math, it's easy to kind of embrace this realism where it's like, well, yeah, I'm talking about reality because that's why I'm doing math is so that I can talk about reality. But it's like, okay, Um, point being that there's always an inference to some theoretical structure when a like shape is concluded geometrically that is not directly perceptible. Excuse me. And even if something were directly perceptible, I mean, what does that tell you? I feel like it tells you that it's something we're evolved to perceive, which since it takes so much energy to sustain us, wouldn't necessarily have any correspondence to reality. So I don't think it often goes in that direction, but the flatter stuff could theoretically go in an interesting direction with regards to epistemology and certainty and like finally actually being able to not always necessarily be talking past each other in a lot of these discourses. So yeah, my main things that I wanted to talk about today were my article, which I was at a point where I was like, am I ever even going to write another article again? Not really, but like, I'm not the type to do something if it's pointless. Obviously, in this case, there's a point to it, and it's super important to oppose the AI is going to kill us thing of like obviously just really funny. The whole like, what's the word? Uh, we have to, control the outcome, blah, blah. I'm thinking like, you're going to be able to give a definition, a sufficiently defined, sufficiently precise definition. Okay. You're going to be able to do that precisely enough to legislate. Sure. Right. Let's just think about the other stuff that people are currently struggling to define. And yeah. But here's the thing. And I was actually thinking I can help with this with a definition of super intelligence. Okay. Because a lot of this stuff, if you define it wrong, you don't get all the plurality of viewpoints. You got to define it so you get all the plurality of the viewpoints. So, yeah, super intelligence being something that it's a bit it's a bit abstract, but I don't think it's too abstract because I can think of a bunch of examples, like something that necessarily took a group effort to make, like a house. So if you think about, a house, it's pretty impressive, pretty dang impressive in a way. It's like I couldn't make that myself. Wow, but I mean, not everybody's going to be perpetually in a awe of mechanical reality and whatnot. But so I could say, well, the house is an example of super intelligence, and so is this AI. So people are all like, it's all scary and good, but it's like, how could it not be? Because we're scarily good too. So why wouldn't this stuff be scarily good? I think it would be less intimidating if we had a better model of language for sure. So there's like a double but it's overcomable for sure. Yeah, it is interesting that it's starting to place this as such a significant part of society. But the thing is that it already, like, super intelligence is already integral in society. Like, I can hardly, like, fuck, excuse me, I can hardly, like, navigate the twirly thing. It's faster than an intersection, but this circly thing in the middle of the road, and you just like get in it and change and whatever. Like, I can barely understand that. So the point being that, like, okay, obviously, I'm joking, but like the point being that I can build my own house, even if I had 20 me's. The point is that, for all but the most fringe examples, super intelligence is not a solo gig. So I was thinking, like, well, if you want to regulate super intelligence, at some point you have to face the benevolent stuff and how important that is with where things go in the future. Because who wants to have to think about every possible outcome? It's just an encumbrance. And what I'm hoping is that this stuff like makes it obvious, like, you can't, you gotta have some super intelligent active organization that makes this its goal to understand and put it forward in a way that can be demonstrated to be for the true betterment of society. And I was thinking of this metaphor of, like, basically we domesticated ourselves and we shouldn't make ourselves look like, you know, grubs. Obviously, that's paraphrasing a lot. But anyway, Stephanie says the AI thing scares me because it can mimic people saying things they never said and others can't distinguish the lie. Yes and no. Stuff like personal identification is actually like there's ways that it's actually um like not really that big of a concern, but okay, yeah, there's issues, but the issues that this is bringing up were already there. Okay. And if something can bring up issues in a way that makes the solution very obvious, isn't that a good thing? Isn't that a good thing? That we can just be like, yeah, wow. Why not make things as amazingly, beautifully, you know, basically perfect as possible? So I wrote an article, and I was laughing at this. I was really laughing at this when I finally looked this up. I was like, "Oh my god." There's no like I don't know if I've ever really seen that in a Wikipedia article that there's no formal definition. Cuz like I've heard of disagreeing on formal definitions. I've more often probably like on interpretations. But this is just, hilariously just it gave me that whole hippie thing with David always saying like, "Oh, you're the prophet from the country, and you can't take your eyes off the king's harem." I'm obviously not being 100% accurate in that quote, but you can look it up. So I remember writing this and kind of forgetting about it because just on a it's not an interesting question to me. The whole computer conscious thing, I don't care because I'd rather focus on something more interesting. And bringing a computer into consciousness kind of seems like the opposite direction of where I'd want to go to apply technology, which would be to like give people a better life. And I don't know what makes people feel better, so I'm kind of relying on them to tell me. But what makes me feel good is like proving myself right repeatedly through self-referential proofs that you know explosively but containedly print money bags of awesomeness. All right, so I attempt to negate the premise of conscious AI. Article contained an example of even a very well-trained machine learning system lacked any conceivable means of performing coherent aggregate decision making on par with the human. Yeah, so that was like where I was more going with it, like to try to make the point that the nature of what we're doing as thinking agents and a computer is doing doesn't really share any structural similarity, nor should we expect it to. Um, and so it was meant to be a counterexample. Back when I thought that a proof might stand a chance at convincing someone. Ha 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 ha. Back in those days. So now I just want to check if this is legible. Like, maybe I should change the color of these fonts. I actually even got a warning on it, and it didn't occur to me. But it's like now that I look at it, it's like, yeah, that's actually kind of terrible, terrible contrast. So anyway, the machine learning system would lack any conceivable means of performing a coherent aggregate decision making on par with a human, but could still emulate a response based on aggregate statistical data derived from extant training corpora. I use books, but theoretically could be any corpus containing a sufficient number of meaningful sentences. And I think with the books, it really makes a big difference because the level of nuances on books, there's tons of that. Because you can even go down to like for super popular books, different like different people's opinions on them that were equally expert in the domain. So I wanted to write another article, and it was the same response. It was people worry about a thing, me saying a thing that hopefully the worrying is probably never going to go away, but it gets a lot better when you can put it towards something good. And so obviously, this stuff happening is probably a little scary and will continue to be for a while. And well, the way I look at that is, why not just be positive about it? And I thought, how can I do that? Well, I just might as well just bathe in the glory of my own correctness. So it's really fun to get ChatGPT to like make it so that it has to answer the way that you want to. Because if you're not specific enough, it's just gonna like fill it in with crap a lot of the time. So it's really important to blah blah. It's like, and for some topics it makes sense, but other topics it's like either redundant or just plain like infantilizingly, condescendingly, almost like wouldn't do it on the basis of having heard it presented that way. an anti-viral marketing campaign or something. Oof. So it says the ideas provide a foundation for the development of modern LLMs, and the basic idea really is how good of an identification, and that is something that is determined by your training data. So, for example, if all these sentences in a book, you've got like, I don't know, 7,000 sentences. Let's say I have no clue, but let's say 7,000 sentences in a book. It's true that all of those sentences are members of that book. It's true that all those characters existed for all those sentences. So stuff like that is information of a kind. And it's like, oh, do we have to actually get into like dissecting all this stuff in literature and understanding? It's like, not really, because the computer can just meta-analyze it better than you and say, well, here's the contours, and you can be like, well, I don't know what the contours are. But it's like, if I'd approximated this as a literature student to actually go and like decompose stories into eigenvectors, but can we even do that? Well, maybe now we can, that we know that the computer can do it. So it's kind of good. This is one thing I think is good. It's like, the computer's functioning on a like computationally equivalent to an eigenbasis at all times because of its optimization mechanism. So it's like, well, we can do that too. And so if we don't, we won't really be competitive with computers. So yay, let's do it. And obviously I don't need to focus that much on telling myself how right I am. That was just a joke. I am really, I guess what I was trying to get to is that I feel like I've turned a corner, and I'm a lot happier now that I don't actually think people are convinced by arguments anymore. And maybe I didn't ever really think that, but I kind of understand it better now or something. So yay me. Okay. I am just really parched, so I might just quickly play this for a few minutes while I get a drink. I am not really used to monologuing, but thanks for tuning in.
Why, with the coelacanth, were you suggesting that it went extinct and then was recreated, or something along those lines?
No, that's quite the opposite of what I said. What I said was fossils appear suddenly, quote unquote, suddenly. They're just there, and the coelacanth it's a good example because when you see the very
I'm going to miss the most is walking out of the tunnel with the Highlanders jersey on, the zoo's pumping, our crowd.
Very first so-called first coelacanth. It's quite easily identifiable as a fish. It's just a fish. As far as I'm aware, it's a scaled fish at that. So scales fully formed, fins fully formed. It's a fish. Nobody's going to mistake it for something else. So there it is, fully formed. First time you see it, 300 million alleged years ago, and then basically you have this hiatus in the fossil record for the evolutionary estimated time of about 240 million years. That's what came before that. Many examples. My slides here, if you want me to show them real quick, James, I'm going to share my screen because I didn't really do this earlier.
We don't need them. We're fine. No.
Okay, so just some quick examples here of what stasis looks like. So here's 3 or 4 examples right here. Take a look at the leaf. Living.
Any unknown facts about the universe, can you predict that those will be known prior to us actually discovering them? It applies to anything in the past too. You don't need to predict what we're going to evolve into. Literally irrelevant.
So geology is not a science either, I guess?
It is.
But seriously, I just want to know where you get the assumption that the way a species looks has anything to do with its genetics.
Well, that's not an assumption. That's literally like.
It is an assumption, I'm afraid, of evolutionary theory.
No, we can literally change the genetics and then watch the species form, and it has a different.
This shape. Is your same argument as we can cut out someone's brain and therefore consciousness comes from the brain.
What? Well,
It's the same argument as that it doesn't actually justify it's just you're just circularly reasserting your presumption. I'm asking, forgive me, if you're going to use an axiom,
causation.
if in my system, if you're going to make something an axiom, it has to actually be empirically verifiable, like anytime you want. It's got to be so obvious as to be borderline self-evident, if there can be such a thing. And this does not really seem that way, because it can actually, be falsified.
Let me say something real quick about this whole prediction conversation. I've got a slightly different perspective than Jen does, but I definitely appreciate what she's saying, because she's absolutely correct, and you're not predicting anything. What you're doing is using inductive or deductive reasoning to basically follow a pattern. That's what you're doing. Okay, but here's the deal: when you start citing prediction as the thing that
Okay. I have no idea what's going on in that debate, but I don't want to necessarily subject people to that. So I guess I pronounced your name wrong. Oops. And I didn't actually see the correct spelling. Friend whose name starts with a non-capital B. Hey, Dark Matter and Battle Rap, it's great to see you. I've missed doing it as well, and just been sort of getting my thoughts together for what direction I want to go in, because obviously, you know, I'm interested in this stuff, and so I've got my article up there, and now I'm going to go through the super fun technical stuff, hopefully. And if there's anything anyone wants to talk about in the chat, I could take breaks. Not saying it's super boring, but it's a little bit dry. It's I won't go through every last bit, but I just want to show people how this stuff basically works, so that they can optimize their use of it. I think if you can think like the computer, you can optimize your use of it. And that the groundwork for LLM technology was laid some time ago with the rise of Gaussian mixture models and neural nets. Below is a diagram depicting how I understand the GMM-UBM framework depicts the basic cycle of machine learning. Computation of a wide scope of results is subsequently reduced based on how much it matches given truth marks. So the important thing to remember here is that hi, Skyworks, nice to see you. There's never 100% determinacy within the truth values. So you can have a long list of truth values for data. It'd be like, oh, the number 4 appears in all these images, blah, blah, blah. But it's never going to give you, the platonic, the proverbial, the deterministic 4. It's just increasing ranges of, or rather decreasing amounts of indeterminacy. So it's not like it can just keep getting more accurate in perpetuity. And I hope that's intuitively obvious. At some point, you will optimize your use of training data. So that's the most important thing, is that every possible computation is carried out, but not every possible computation is kept. And that's kind of the same with the images. You can generate a bunch of images, and some of them you don't necessarily keep them because they weren't great. And then you get one great 1 out of 4, and then you take that in a new direction. And a lot of times it's just sort of building up a basis of prompts that you are increasingly familiar with over a increasing domain of applicability. So here's your basic approach. You're starting with 2 columns and ending with 1, and that's results. And then you have some aggregate result from the blues, which is going to tell you, how good the computation was. And the leaning into the strength of computers is basically just what is the strength of computers? Well, brute force. So what does that mean? Well, just carry out every possible computation within a certain range. And what's the right range? Well, to some extent, the data can actually tell you what the right range is because the computer's capable of being trained to detect contours within the data, which is regions of the where there is not a boundary, but minimally a non-boundary, a minimized non-boundary, which behaves like a boundary, excuse me, for a lot of applications, which is something else that I was also working on and I'm looking forward to sharing. And I've got this diagram that, like, honestly, it's so simple, but it's the culmination of about 3 years of work. So I'm just going to add that and like put a bookmark in it for after, but this is all going somewhere, I promise. And this is very general. Retain some percentage P of C for which C maximally aligns with the truth marks. So we have like a kind of a double indeterminacy. We know that some people have marked some equivalencies between these and they're accurate, but that doesn't generalize to every case. But maybe we could get it to come close to generalizing for every case. And rather than even trying to do that, just make the every case generalization an abstract edge detection where you're imposing these abstract boundaries that don't actually have any materialistic representation, but it's good because the representation that you want is informational. The evolution from GMM UBM to modern LLM framework involves two steps: exploitation of intrinsic truth marks and simulation reduction, which I will now discuss. Firstly, it's reasonable to presume to apparently my own writing is not making much sense to me here. That any intelligible component of a document is true in the sense it accords with the conventions of the English language. Yes, this is what I was talking about before. Like, the conventions aren't actually all true at all times. Conventions sort of depend on where you are. Conventions in a dentist office versus a nightclub are different. They both exist. They have fuzzy boundaries. They aren't equal, but the concept of it is extremely useful. The concept of a convention, and it's pretty accurate. So, like, as accurate as any training data that you've got with like voices to label that book, a given book is abiding by the conventions of whatever domain it's being applied to. So, and the truth value is yes for all those sentential components. Then the problem reduces to optimally defining intelligible components. So there's, why don't we just make words the irreducible component? Well, you can, but it doesn't really work that well to make words the irreducible component because, like, the better thing would actually be more on the level of a paragraph to a page. Now that would probably be after there's pre-processing, but at the, I wouldn't go further down than a sentence. And that's because words are sets of context relations to other words. So we don't want the context relation on top of that, the synthetic context relation, to also be a word, because that's not the point of a synthetic context relation. It's to abstract more information. So it's very easy to just say, well, if a sentence is in a book, then it's true. And so voila, you have tons of training data. And so the fact that there are many books that exist. Okay, Stephanie says they're lost. I'm really sorry. I guess this stuff is a bit mathematical and hard to follow. So I will have to work on that. But we're into a topic that it is a bit hard to talk about because it's like the philosophy of language and understanding how language interfaces with our understanding of reality. Most people don't think about how to define the word definition. Like, what does it mean to define a definition? Well, it may not mean anything. It may just be a trick of language, but it's definitely true that words are defined by other words. So if every word is defined by other words, then the meaning is not in the words. It's nowhere, but it is, less nowhere in some places than others. So obviously, where you draw the line on the irreducible unit of meaning in decomposing a book is going to depend on your personal understanding of language. But I would say a sentence is true in that it accords with the conventions of language. Yeah, a lot of times people have trouble with what I'm saying, and I think I can explain a little bit better why that is because I use top-down metaphysics in my thought process, and most people do not necessarily have. Well, I actually think everybody does top-down metaphysics, but they're not aware of it. So if you're not aware of something that you're doing, then it's pretty much in a way like you're not doing it. But it's possible to learn. It takes time. It's worthwhile, whatever. You can get benefits from it without 100% assimilating it as knowledge, although I'm not really sure how to do that. So I will hopefully clear this up a little bit with the next examples. We're now halfway to understanding the function of modern LLMs. The next leg is simulation reduction. And it was so funny because, like, when I first read that, I'm like, I couldn't even remember what the hell I was talking about when I wrote this. I'm like, damn, I should have reread this before I did the show. But obviously, no, I didn't want to do that. Oh, well, I can't really complain because I think I'm pretty productive. Yeah, compared to what I could be. How natural language answers could be prompted from machine learning engines like ChatGPT. For that, I present 3 consecutive diagrams. The diagrams depict a simpler technology, image generation. So what I'm going to do is throw out language because language is not easy enough to understand. So instead of using language, we're just going to use the objects of language, so image things. And so the idea here is you have a bunch of different images where it's true that there is a banana in those images. And if that still doesn't make sense, well, I'm not sure what to say. I'll think about it. But the idea is that the system is able to build an aggregate representation, which is a bunch of proportionalities within an image, aka contour detection. So think of King Banana here as like a set of contours that accord with the contours of a banana. And filter out the stuff that is not a banana. And then you have your aggregate banana. So that's basically taking an image and reducing it to a set of relationships in space. The computer determines what all bananas have in common, stores this identity as an aggregate banana. And so I've got my aggregate filter principle given a set of truth mark training data, D1 to Dn of type T, depicting an object O, and computational aggregator, a filter to detect O in any given datum of type T may be constructed. So basically, if we have enough training data, we can build a filter that is going to tell us whether another image has that training data thing. Most important thing is that we've got a filter that, to a very high accuracy, can detect bananas. It's kind of like the show Silicon Valley where they had the, hot dog, not hot dog. That was a funny show. All right, so composite aggregate filter principle, same idea, but just extremely simplistic, adding together. It is possible to build composite filters and just say, well, I don't just want, a banana or a pineapple. I want both, or I actually want all three: strawberry, pineapple, and banana. I want you to only show me an image if it has those three things, in this hypothetical basis of images that exists. And we're still at the detection stage. We're not actually at the interesting stage yet. But the good detection is sort of the setup to the good generation. So you get the filters, and then you say, hey, I can put these filters together. So that is sort of I don't want to say an art in itself, but yeah, there's some savoir faire to, well, how do we actually put this composite filter together? And then I've got the composite aggregate filter principle given a set of filters F1 to Fn. A composite filter F containing all the conditions of F1 to Fn may be constructed. All good. All right, so composite aggregate generation principle. This is a little bit more complicated because here we want to think of like images that, like, you have to kind of think about generating every possible image. So not every image is going to have objects in it. Most images that you can generate are going to be unintelligible nonsense. Only images that have particular proportions of contours are going to have recognizable images. So that's basically what this AI is doing is, excuse me, making images that are going through all these filters. Now, the filters that the quote prompt engineer, the person making the images, those words are filters of a kind. But the software has already filters in it because it's not going to present you with images that don't have like recognizable shapes in it. So it's already removing a lot of what you might call noise. So we've got this image on the right here with a bunch of, I made that with Dolly as well. So yeah, that was meant to show, like, to depict making every possible image, but only keeping some of them. And if you want an actual example of this, is when the Midjourney is rendering the images, it'll actually show you, like, it's really neat. I don't know if that was actually just an artifact or what, but it seemed to like depict the process of rendering the image. And it was really cool because it had like a vague outline of what it ended up being, but it's almost indescribable how it evolved. So composite filter, or so wide range of images simulated, and then composite filter. And that's basically how AI works. It generates every possible combination of words that for which the answer is true when the question is asked, is this a sentence? And not just that, is this a sentence? And are these sentences a good answer to the question of blah, blah, blah? So the computer thinks through the following steps: estimating contextually optimized meta content, and then simulating ranges of content, and context-dependent multi-subconditional optimization. Contextually optimized meta content is the determination of approximately how long an answer ought to be. Simulated ranges of content correspond to all sets of word combinations that match one. Context-dependent multi-subconditional optimization is the choice between all sets of possible word combinations based on based on which simultaneously fulfills the most simultaneous context-dependent criteria. I think I should have reread this a few more times because this is not quite making sense to me right now, but hopefully it all comes together with let's just focus on the diagrams. The globally across all relevant criteria optimized response is then presented to the prompter. How does it work? Language does not have rules, but it has conventions. Conventions appear as structure, and structure may be approximated in a rule-like way with what I was calling pseudo rules. Through Boolean computational brute force, LLMs exploit the structural relationship between language and the pseudo rules inferred through training data. The LLM can thus determine which set of words within the associated relevant ranges of simulated words best conforms to the context-dependent pseudo rules, which are determined by the prompt. I think the most important development that these models enables is natural language programming, or more specifically, they enable pseudocode to code translation. And this means you don't need to learn a computer programming language to implement an algorithm. You just need a working command structure. Pseudocode, I believe Boolean logic and its coding languages are massive bottlenecks to technologically assisted vision actualization, and look forward to LMs overcoming this practical limitation. Yeah, so one thing I was thinking that would be fun is like sometimes with TV shows, if they're trying to like reverse, like go back, 5 years or 10 years in the past, like it's not a huge amount of age difference, and they're like using the same actor, but like either changing their hair or putting a bunch of makeup, but you can kind of tell that they're the same age. But you can actually make them look, to the day, reverse age them. It's just, I mean, that's such a niche application, but that was just something that popped into my head. Is like, wow, that would be awesome. Okay, so that's basically what I wanted to talk about is how your basic approach to both of these technologies is generation of a large range of possibility and then reduction based on filters. And I'm, at some point in the future, going to argue that that's basically how our consciousness works. So this AI technology may end up being a really good metaphor for our consciousness. Maybe not the individual computers, which is what a lot of people have been saying, but maybe this integral processing could actually be a really good metaphor, because throughout my research, I found that filter as a metaphor is quite good. All right, so nice to see the other people in the chat. And yeah, I'm going to work on trying to make this stuff make more sense, hopefully. Slick Willie, nice to see you. Let's see here. Humans taught the AIs. It's our imagination that give it design. Yeah, exactly. So we can be scared of our own imagination, but at the same time, it's like, I don't know. Maybe fear is just inevitable and you have to go through the fear and just experience fear until you eventually get bored of it. And then it's like, okay, maybe it comes up again, but you can just extinguish it with the power of boredom. Just a thought. I've got a, I guess I don't know if it's like dyslexia or what. I just have a really hard time writing and having it make sense. But this is something I've been working on for a while. See if it looks okay if I got it on the screen here. Okay, I'll just wonder if I can have these two be both on the screen at the same time. It doesn't look like it because I feel like this is like borderline not readable. All right, let me know if this is readable or if it's an issue, because I will narrate it. And it's an introduction to dual aspect non-dualism. And yeah, I wanted to talk it out, and hopefully it is helpful for anyone who is interested in learning this stuff. And I think I finally got it at the point where I don't want to say I can't get stumped, but at least the rational justifications that I struggled with earlier are, I feel like they're going in a direction of getting ironed out. The stuff like the trilemma. Okay. Um I feel like I at least know where to slightly go for this stuff, because for a while I thought it would just be fine to have only the mind is a quantum computer and that would be sufficient. But then I realized like it's not. And I would rather have it be a little bit more complicated. Okay, it's not readable. Thank you. Okay, so what I'll do is like make it, let me think if I can resize it. Yeah, that'll work. I think this will be, how about that? Okay. Hopefully that's all right. Well, thanks for sharing that, Stephanie. And also Bob Elvis. Please tell me how to pronounce that because now I'm going to feel weird about it. All right. So I'm glad that I was able to get that displayed. So, anyway, just all this rambling. And I haven't mentioned this yet, but I went on this community space that was really fun. I got to talk about, I called it street metaphysics, which I thought was hilarious. So I just, because I've had so much experience talking to people doing street epistemology, I kind of responded with street metaphysics because I don't want to say I love metaphysics. I do. I just, in the sense of what I'm debating or what I would be discussing, would be like, it's a necessary condition for mathematical coherence, but I didn't really want to look at that stuff because I just don't like the conflict sometimes that comes up with those ideas. So, but finally, I've figured out a way to sidestep it by taking words that are already floating around, but just rearranging them in a manner that I'm pretty sure no one else has used. And if they have, God bless them. All right, so I know there was dual aspect monism, which it's just like there. I don't see a whole lot that it actually reminds me of what my thing is. So, not that it has to be identical, like I'm perpetually likening Hinduism to Buddhism. That's because I can see why. I can also see why someone would totally disagree, and it's totally fine. But like, what the point being that to go to war, so to speak, over a label like that is it's kind of like why. Oh, and when I don't have to, I can just say I realize I can just say dual aspect non-dualism, which no one's really using, as far as I know. So consciousness is neither substance or property, but a process unifying matter into a single substance, exuding a single property. So consciousness brings together nothingness or emptiness and becomes simultaneously substance and property. In other words, there's a co-arising between substance and propertyness along the boundary of consciousness, if you will. This unifying process is called interferentiality, the possibility of undergoing interference. Interferentiality is a mechanical reassertion of the principle of impermanence. Since impermanence is true, material structure changes on an ongoing basis, and the cause of this change is interferential observation. Okay, so a little bit circular, but have to start somewhere, and it's absolutely properly basic to have a concept of, what did I put? Interferential observation and then vibration as the somewhat equivalent, but not quite, but also keeping in mind words can't really encompass these concepts. What we're after is a subject level understanding of it. So let me see here. This is the most important thing to have a subject level understanding of that most people don't get, because it's just like I don't know, it doesn't even necessarily take that long to get, but I think probably the sheer unknown of it is like, well, I don't need to do it. So, and just from experience, see most people aren't predisposed to doing stuff they don't necessarily have to. So to me, it's about certainty. Like I want to feel that actual epistemic certainty, that actual confidence to be like, yeah, okay, I'm I'm good. And that comes from not just like negating your presuppositions, because I know there's like other people that talk about these kinds of ideas. It's not just paying lip service to that, it's knowing how to not quite negate suppositions, but realign awareness so that you're maximally filtering out the bias of your presuppositional load. Okay. So, yeah, everything is going to ultimately come back to, if you want to know for sure, just get the very direct experience yourself. Go there yourself and directly check. The door is always open to kind of do that. And that requires this understanding of it's just like, yeah, once you can negate the presupposition, you can set up a way to optimize like you can take something that used to be a weakness and turn it into a strength, like annoyingness. So anyway, the ubiquitousness of impermanence can give rise to the appearance of fuzzy boundaries, which is what I was alluding to over here. This diagram, being really important, even though it's super simple, is like the coming into being of a boundary. Since apparent boundaries comprise the structure of matter, concept of boundary consciousness figures centrally in my approach to modeling consciousness. A boundary separates a finitude on the inside of actuality within an infinitude of potentiality. When a boundary references a living material body, it is useful to use a separate term to reference the perspective originating inside the boundary and directed outward. I call this a perspective the subject. To summarize, the model systems, I put is, but it should be as, a series of decreasingly subtle, which means the same as increasingly gross aspects from mind to matter to boundary and finally subject. In the remainder of this essay, I'll research the least action principle in terms of my framework as the subject independent minimization of material boundaries and expound this particular cosmology. Matter consciousness. So we're starting with absolute non-dualism. Then there's a mind as an ordering principle. And then matter is kind of where we want to go directly for a couple reasons. It's structure adjacent. And it is the substance, quote unquote, of shared experience. And as we'll see, and those who are interested in this stuff already have already seen, there is a high level placed on not purely intuitive knowledge, but there's a lot of importance placed on how easily something is memorized, which is connected to how it feels, emotions to some extent. The process of matter consciousness is interferential observation. Matter is the stuff detected by perception as well as the stuff comprising the body that enables subjective perception. In this sense, matter comprises both observer and observation. Since interference arises in proximity to its antecedent, material consciousness can also be described as the deformation of adjacent information. Matter consciousness makes 5 similar discoveries: space-time, mass, charge, and temperature. And so I call these the 5 gross localizations of matter. These localizations are mediated by 4 irreducible components: neutron, proton, electron, photon. And so I call them the 4 subtle components of matter. This is nothing really new. And I didn't even come up with the 5 similar discoveries. It was actually Thad Roberts, who did his work with the hyperbolic complement of the figure eight knot. So I'm basically on board with saying, that sounds right. That seems to be the right number of possible observables. And so the trick here comes in with saying, well, I have this, basically there's the myth of the third person perspective and the entanglement of space and time with the other three observables is hopefully going to make it more obvious why we can't juxtapose our subjective interpretation of space-time onto physics when the level on which these observables is defined is, logically contradicted by more certain experiments. I depict matter consciousness in two main categories: the quantum mechanical periodic table, QMPT, and the hyperbolic complement of figure eight knot, HFAC. The QMPT depicts the space-time limit as 59 spheres ranged antisymmetrically in two graduated square pyramids, whereas the HF8C depicts the space-time limit as a continuous surface. The faces are removed to depict the inside of the image below. Each represents the same information, the former dualistically and the latter non-dualistically, a connection I will explore in greater detail in a later section. I'll next discuss the consciousness of boundary within which the appearance of separateness within wholeness occurs. So here's this, it's a really important diagram again, appearance of separateness within wholeness. So this is also what's going on here. And basically what it's saying is that finitude and separateness and insideness, those are almost all the same thing. And then they can become different depending on what scale being resolved at, which is going to have to do with observation, which is going to have to do with, oh, you guessed it, 3 + 1. Let's see where I've gotten to here. Matter refers to the domain. Okay, so the next part here is boundary consciousness. Matter refers to the domain where the condition of observability holds, and where observability holds, it is possible for individual observations to come into being. So we're looking at a nested simulation thing, but the simulations are very stable. So, it's a simulation plus. I designate the boundary between observer and observation to be the precondition for individual instances of observation. The possibility of individual observation is thus conditional on separation between an observer and its observation. The image of boundary consciousness is thus conditionality. So a boundary and a condition, almost the same. Because when there's a condition, there's a boundary between what's possible and impossible, and namely the condition's possible, and not the condition is impossible. I've chosen to define the particular conditionality of the boundary as the appearance of separation between inside and outside of a condition. I use the boundary to model matter and geometry to model boundaries. This choice is useful since the inside-outside dichotomy is well defined both mathematically and physically. Now, maybe if you're thinking, oh, there's more than one definition of that, and I'll say, well, that's good, because we want to have to justify every definition that we use, and leaving the door open for possibly a better one. Finally, a body refers to a finite amount of matter where the associated perspective is of the outside from the outside. So when we're talking about a body, there's an implicit externality to it, because when we're talking about a body from its own internal perspective, it is called a subject. When I changed this the format of this document so that it would display, it looks like it messed up the display for was supposed to just be really simple partial derivative, but that didn't come through. But anyway, dB, it's like del B by del C. I feel like annoyed that I don't even know this, but what it means is partial derivative. Okay, so if humans on Earth are the only consciousness in the universe, apart from God and his angels, then would the distant galaxies be largely uninterferentiated, like largely undefined? Well, I don't know, because I don't think humans are the only consciousness in the universe. Like, I don't think that makes sense. I don't think panentheism makes any sense. So MOP says consciousness seems like a read-write ISO disk image loaded. When I wake up, the disk is still loaded. Yeah, so remember, consciousness. Okay, so your personality and your perceptions aren't the same thing. And when you start, it's really easy to like confuse them together. Okay, they're not the same thing. There's perceptions happening, and then there's a personality, which is both molding the perceptions and also responding to the perception. That's very, you gotta be like, okay, so think about it like this. How are we supposed to understand consciousness? Well, it depends on the field. And the field here is physics. So this is my opinion on how you should understand consciousness. You're going to have your own opinion already on what you think consciousness is, and that's fine, but that probably isn't going to be the same as physics. That doesn't mean like anything other than we have a difference of opinion. And so I'm saying anything that's not panpsychism, aka everything is starting with consciousness and it's a universal fact. Anything other than that is not going to be coherent. And that may not be coherent either, but it could be coherent. So I'm making assertions like, well, this could be coherent and this couldn't be coherent because I negate it on this basis. And that's how I don't deal with contradictions, but I do negate premises. But the negations are conditional on the conditions that negated them. And sometimes the conditions are amazing, like, 3 + 1 in its meaning and context is not going to change because it's the periodic table information, and that's not something changeable. All right. So it's totally easy to like or totally natural to have a pre-existing definition of consciousness. That is not necessarily going to line up with mine, but that's fine. Just think of it as having two definitions. You have your own subjective definition, and then you have the one for where you actually want to understand physics, and in that one, it has a very particular meaning because it's defined in such a way so that everything is conscious. And why is everything conscious? Because there can't be any boundaries. And for there to be something that was unconscious would mean there was a boundary between consciousness and unconsciousness. And from our perspective, there's just no like utility to that boundary. So least action principle in terms of boundaries, motivating the logic of matter more generally in the sense that boundaries are subject to a global minimization principle. If a collection of aggregate boundaries B represents the formation energy of a physical system, then by the least action principle, B is subject to I didn't write the letter A in there, global minimization. Oh, whoops, actually, sorry. B is subject to global minimization with respect to all possible conditions C, bringing about observation. Okay, so I'm super happy about that because now I'm able to like model interferometers or observation devices as, you guessed it, boundaries. So I really like that. Any boundary is going to be minimized. And so something like a ruler, that's absolutely totally minimized in terms of bringing about the condition of observation because it only has the trivial case of localizing photons to a surface, which is interferential, but it's barely interferential because the ruler is mostly unchanged by the interaction, except that some light reflected off it, right? So that's in a lot of cases what it ends up being for interferentiality. But when you're talking about subjectivity, no, it's not like a ruler. Right? The interferentiality is non-trivial there, and so it does really matter. But these examples where it's trivial really help to build up the intuition, so they shouldn't be neglected. Partial derivative of the boundary with respect to an observable condition is minimized for all conditions. I've reasserted the least action principle in terms of boundaries. So that was supposed to say del B, del C is subject to a global minimization principle. So no matter what the boundaries are of a system, they're globally minimized. I've thus demonstrated the boundary to be a useful concept in theoretical physics insofar as a physical system can be expressed as a collection of boundaries. A premise I will fully justify later on. Like, I think that's already pretty obvious with computers, but it's worth explaining quite a bit, obviously. As well, boundary is the basis of empiricism. The body is the basis of the subject, and subjective empiricism is the basis of epistemology. This trifecta accords the boundary both physical and metaphysical status, elevating it to central prominence. In the next section, I'll discuss the consciousness of subjectivity, the internal perspective of the boundary. Subjective consciousness. So this gets a lot more complicated, and that's awesome because that's what you kind of want. I think it's important to have, I guess arbitrary complexity kind of sounds wrong, but like optimized understanding per level of zooming in on something. So if we're talking about the universe, like cosmology and stars and stuff, like it doesn't matter. The flavor of strawberries doesn't matter. How you feel about blah, blah, blah doesn't matter because it's about mechanics, cosmic mechanics. It's super important. But then we actually do kind of want to understand, or at least I do, excuse me, want to understand consciousness subjectively if I want to. So that means I have to be able to go in, zoom into just the particular case of the subject, and then direct the power of the infinite mind into it, maximally resolving all of its canonical structures. So we aren't too far off from what the materialists are saying. Like, I will fully admit this is a heavily materialistic model, and I'm happy about that because that makes it more scientifically rigorous and observationally tighter. So we've got nothing, and then we're saying, okay, we need a mind, and that mind has a material aspect, and then that material has a separateness, a tendency to appear separate, which is where the boundary comes in. That's perfectly relatable. We can all agree that we've seen what appear to be finite amounts of matter. And then we have subjective consciousness, mind kind of bobbing back up after we've gone through the come from mind to matter, boundary, and now we're at the individual subject where we do want to be able to catch all the various layers in it. You know, I don't know if it's obvious now to have a definition where consciousness is necessarily a material property. And then it has to do with how many micro states you can simulate cognitively as well as corporeally. So two people who weigh the same wouldn't necessarily be as conscious as each other because it would have their level of consciousness, their amount of consciousness they actually possess in their mass would be something that depended on their own state of mind at any given time, which has to do with not quite what you believe, because actually, according to my system, beliefs are pretty fixed. They're intrinsic, like they're almost at an impossibility of the contrary with regards to beliefs. Like the thing that is believed in my system is personality. So very limited amount of that. So don't want to get too far off. I'll come back into what I was actually saying originally, which is we've kind of got, like, obviously I haven't talked about cosmology or solved all that or anything, gone into cosmic mechanics, but in terms of metaphysics, that's basically it. You've got universe with nothing, universe with mental ordering principle, universe with material ordering principle, boundary, and now finally subject, which is equivalent to a boundary, except that it's a different perspective. Because a boundary, included in its definition, is external. Perceiving finiteness when a boundary is concerned has to be something done externally. Because from our own perspective, we can't really validate finitude, because what we experience is a form of infinitude in the sense we exist in an infinite universe. So the perspective co-arising with the boundary is itselfness. This is what I was referring to before, that this definition takes into account like an actual perspective. When you're talking about something being itself, the mental motion you want to associate with that is, you think of like an apple and you're looking at it and it appears to be, you don't see the whole apple, but you see that it has a boundary and that it's finite. And that's the important part. You can recognize an apple based on its boundary, which is essentially a two-dimensional object. And so when we talk about a boundary, that just to talk about a person in terms of its selfness, I would say is insufficient. So want to add this extra concept called the subject, which is the boundary of a body, but the perspective is from the inside. The recognition of a thing as itself co-arises with the individual perception of its apparent boundary from the outside. I call the perspective opposite the boundary the subject. In my system, subjectivity is the internal perspective of a boundary directed outward, while objectivity is the external perspective of boundary directed inward. So I'm kind of playing with this definition of objectivity, and I think I need to keep it, which means that matter then becomes objective, even though it doesn't have any objects. So I think that's how I'm going to dodge the problem of Platonic, like that there is a level of Platonism in the shapes in the periodic table, but that like there is no, Platonic table in any mechanical sense. So since the individual subject is the shared epistemological condition, subjective consciousness is the most familiar of the three aspects of consciousness. I describe the first-person experience of subjectivity as absolutely parsimonious induction of nested fuzzy boundaries. So if you want to have a look at your own thought process and then ask yourself, well, does absolutely parsimonious induction of nested fuzzy boundaries accord with what I'm experiencing? And yeah, hopefully I can explain what this is effectively. So in order to clarify this concept, I'll decompose this description into three components: absolute parsimony, nested fuzzy boundaries, and induction. Absolutely parsimonious, just really quick, is as simple as possible. But then since geometries that we use to decompose things and decide whether those geometries are simple, not that there are different ways to geometrically decompose things. So what simple means is not always, that's why I put as parsimonious, because we don't want to make any metaphysical commitments. Induction of nested fuzzy boundaries. So nested fuzzy boundaries is the easiest one to explain because it's pretty much what you're seeing. It's the perception, visual cortex. We appear to the appearance is that there are boundaries between what we perceive as objects. So basically a cup, anything really. And I'm saying since those boundaries don't actually exist in perpetuity, they're fuzzy and they're nested because we're capable of detecting them on multiple orders of magnitude, like the moon, for example. You can tell. Absolutely parsimonious, that means this can be the simplest explanation as possible. Again, that's going to be relative to belief. And induction, that's sort of your judgment. That's the non-linguistic choice agent, and that's very complicated and can be unlocked even further depending on the application. So some cases, just talking about it, sort of brushing past it, breezing over it is sufficient. In other cases, you really want to take it apart and look at the, maybe not qualities, but correlates, physical correlates of the one's own individual process of induction. But I'm basically trying to solve the problem of induction by defining it as necessary. So therefore tautological. In a sense, you kind of dodge needing to really explain it when, oh, well, it is actually always going on. And induction is just the process of fragmented consciousness kind of rediscovering itself. So part one, absolute parsimony, pretty straightforward. It just relates to impermanence and that the number of boundaries is trending towards zero. It's never quite zero, never quite one. And so all the interesting stuff is happening in that infinite possibility between 0 and 1. So in particular, absolute parsimony of subjective consciousness refers to the use of embodied memory to make sense of, and how I'm defining that is render intelligible perception in the simplest way possible. Prior to initiation, absolute parsimony is determined by a combination of socio-linguistic influence and subjective disposition towards associated memorized content. So hopefully this isn't too much of a word salad, but basically the explanations are explanations that we speculate about causes are things that we are familiar with. And the things we're familiar with are social-linguistic. So that's, saying, okay, you're influenced by a bunch of stuff, and the aspects of the stuff you're influenced by, we're going to call social and linguistic because they're both important subjectively, but they're a little bit different in how they relate to ideas. Initiation inculcates the capacity for determinations of parsimony to be made on a non-linguistic basis. And this is where you optimize your, subconscious or instinctive cognition. Because having to go through words are important, Think about the prompting with the images. They work out really well when you know the right words, but the place that the good words come from is wordless. And I don't want to be too much digressing constantly into those, seeming contradictions, abstract things, but just going to put that there to remind myself. In particular, the absolute parsimony of subjective consciousness refers to the use of embodied memory to make sense. Okay, I said that already. Actualization of non-linguistic parsimony then depends on individual practice. Traditionally, this extra-linguistic basis is called the oral tradition. Part 2, nested fuzzy boundaries. I call the aspect of subjectivity that confers the appearance of evolving boundaries within perception nested fuzzy boundaries, NFBs. Subjective NFBs generate nested boundaries by simultaneously differentiating between perceptual structures across multiple orders of magnitude. Since they're generated by evolving subjects, NFBs are also evolving and thus fuzzy. For example, despite its appearance changing throughout the cycle, the moon is still cognized as a single entity. NFBs are an important concept because I use them to define language. NFBs structure the appearances of matter, and so are the individual bases of aggregate perceptual cognition. Since aggregate perceptual cognition is also the basis of language, NFBs are the structure of the basis of an individual's capacity to engage with conventional language. And so the interconceptual boundary is a necessary precondition for the intelligibility of conventional language. Since NFBs resolve recognizable boundaries, their experience tends to vary less between users of a particular language. Yeah, so this isn't my thoughts on this aren't super organized yet, but I think I've got my categories down, at least for now. Part 3, induction. Third and final component of subjectivity is induction, which corresponds to the choice event. Induction is the deliberate aspect of subjectivity and corresponds to an appearance of sense-making or agency. When the body is awake, induction spontaneously frames sensuous perception through recombined memories on an ongoing basis. Since induction is deliberate and deliberation depends on rational intention, so when I say rational, I am talking about basically stuff we can hypothetically put into words as intentionally being formally structured. So not necessarily shackled some interpretation of logic, but rational meaning structured and justified, which varies based on circumstance. The individual process of induction has greater intersubjective variation than NFBs, but less so than absolute parsimony, which affects both rational and sub-rational intention. And I think knowing stuff like this is great because a lot of times there's communication breakdowns with other people, and through this lens you can kind of say, oh, this is maybe why this person is not understanding me, because they relate to this perceptual construct completely differently from me. And maybe I can explain it in a way that'll actually make the point that it wouldn't make sense to me, but makes total sense to them. So, summary: consciousness and matter discovers the possible range of physical properties within 3+1 degrees of actualizable dimensionality. The consciousness boundary enables the appearance of separation to arise within wholeness, which forms the basis of all finite conceptualization. So that's a really hard one, I think, to really talk about, and I'm going to be focusing on this more. But like the idea that it's the finiteness of our physical body that makes it so that we can perceive seemingly infinite concepts. I think that's super counterintuitive, but at the same time, that it really goes along with the boundary concept that I have, that the co-arising between finite and infinite can be made coherent through a boundary, which stitches them together in the conceptual space. Whoops. Okay, subjective consciousness enacts absolutely parsimonious, nested, fuzzy boundaries upon a generalized process of induction, which obtains the bringing into being of possibility. And so I've given a model for matter as the gross limit of mind, boundary as the interferential limit of matter, and subject is what it should be as the inner perspective of boundary. So yeah, that's what I've been working on, and I guess it helps to read it out loud because there's still some errors in those sentences, but hopefully I made my point somewhat. And yeah, I appreciate the contributions in the chat. Thanks for saying hi. Mr. Orb says consciousness can be the CEO, but most of the time it's a customer walking around the store enjoying samples and considering purchases. Yes, that's true. There's quite a observer aspect of consciousness. All right, so I'll probably wrap this up soon. I've covered stuff I wanted to go over. I had this hilarious meme that I just can't believe how quickly the whole thing is going from to like to like, oh my god. But I guess I shouldn't be too surprised, but I think the best way forward is by being responsible adults and saying, okay, time to put the grown-up pants on now and just put it, let's look at things as how good could things be. I think they could be pretty great. And why not have, I don't want to say have school go on forever, but first of all, have school be good and then have it go on forever. It's just an idea. And I have one last diagram that I'll show before I say goodbye is for subjectivity. I thought, and I got this image off of Dolly, obviously, but yeah, I was thinking like how to sort of explain to people that it's not necessarily a good idea to try to progress as far as possible into the conscious arts for clout or whatever. And it's you can hurt yourself going too fast because there's this step in between that, when you start out, you're kind of more or less aligned romantically towards realism in the direction of individuated self. And that's just this notion of there's a person there and that person exists. So there's a person there and that person exists. And then, how could that not be true? And so it's perspectively not, it's nothing more than a perspective essentially. So you can get this other perspective where that's just not how it feels, I guess. But the process of getting it is transformative. So that's what is meant to be at step 2. So like step 1 is when you start off identified with naive realism, it's like being on the edge of a really wafy kind of plant. Sorry, flower. But one of those flowers where if you touch it, it just sort of almost dies immediately. And it can be really easily pushed around, but it also has all sorts of beauty. And nobody can really disagree that the most beautiful part of a plant is the flower. And so that's where it starts with this. That's more of an innocence kind of living uh, subjectively and living individually. And the problem with individually living is, it's not a problem. But when you start to extrapolate that to assuming it's true for physics, then you're probably going to make a lot of errors. And then so we're at a bit of a bifurcation where we have to decide, well, do we go for trying to understand the stuff directly through enlightenment and have to do all that work? Or do we just assume the logic is correct and apply it and hope for the best? Well, I think it's good to realize that what you believe about physics or philosophy and what you experience or identify with immediately doesn't have to necessarily line up, because there is an element of faith, just like there's faith, and you have to put faith in the idea that a a sentence or a proposition could exist in a truth-making fashion. So there's no one answer other than if you want lasting change in your own perspective and experience of this stuff, then you have to do it slowly. There's really no other way. But other than that, I'm hoping that this is a good introduction to what I've been, well, to basically, like, I've been at this for quite a while. Like, this is kind of the last 3 years of what I've been trying to put together is the next step after, well, the mind's a quantum computer, which, you know, starting to sound like that was all I was saying. So, anyway, I'm looking forward to the next one. And if there's any particular topics specifically with regards to AI, like I'm totally into that stuff. So hopefully we can talk about that more.